Hey, Michael, guess what?
What?
The contents of the lab report are meant for educational purposes only.
You mean they're not meant to be misconstrued as medical diagnosis or treatment advice?
No way.
Today, on the lab report, a little vitamin called B12.
Also known as cobalamin.
Yeah, you think it feels bad about being the last of the B vitamins?
No, it's a vitamin. It doesn't have feelings.
Oh, you don't think it's waiting around for a B13?
Bingo. The world of medicine can be challenging. Clinicians and patients are always looking for more options, more effective treatments, and in the end, more answers. Functional and integrative medicine focuses on addressing root causes of disease. Here at Genova Diagnostics, we've watched this field evolve and grow for over 35 years. We've not only adapted, we've led. Join us as we talk about functional medicine, laboratory testing, and optimizing health. Welcome to the Lab Report.
Yeah, so I ended up just bringing some eggnog in. It's in the fridge.
Why would you do that?
Because it's delicious.
It's like 1,000 calories per glass.
I like to put it in my coffee.
Oh my God.
Hello!
Hey, Michael Chapman.
Hi,
How are
Patty
you?
Whoa. I'm great. How are you, Patty Devers?
I'm great today too, Michael. I'm crushing it.
Yeah, you were crushing it all over my little intro there.
Well, I got excited about the eggnog.
I understand. It's understandable. Well, I hope you're doing well. Everyone out there.
Right.
Welcome to this podcast called The Lab Report, brought to you by Genova Diagnostics, where we talk about functional medicine, specialty lab testing, and integrative therapeutics.
And eggnog, apparently.
Yeah, sometimes.
If you like eggnog, you should probably go to iTunes or Spotify and subscribe to this show. Maybe rate and review, leave us some feedback, some stars, things like that.
If you don't like eggnog, you can go ahead and subscribe to this show on iTunes. You can rate, review, you can leave us some stars. And if you have feedback, you can send that feedback to podcast@gdx.net.
So let's not talk about that you put it in your coffee. Let's just move on.
Why? What's so wrong with putting it in my coffee? It's just a little bit of splash, a little flavor. You have coffee with eggs in the morning. A lot of people have that for breakfast. So just put it in one drink. You know what I'm saying?
Wow.
What?
It's really interesting logic.
Why are you judging me about my eggnog
I love it.
and my coffee?
I love it.
It's delicious.
Well, today we're talking about vitamin B12.
Yes.
And it got me to thinking, first and foremost, in the vitamin world, there are water-soluble vitamins, and then there are fat-soluble vitamins.
That's right. That's right? Truth. Yes.
And, the fat-soluble vitamins are vitamin A, vitamin D, vitamin E, vitamin K. So then there's all the water-soluble vitamins.
Yes. The B vitamins, vitamin C.
Like, why is vitamin C the outlier? Like, why isn't...
I see where you're going. Yeah. What's the naming convention here?
Yeah.
Well, I assume... Here's my really ridiculous assumption.
Go ahead.
Like they started with the alphabet, right? When they were discovering these things, and so they started with A, B, and C, and they probably weren't distinguishing fat soluble versus water soluble. Oh. But along the way, I don't know why they did this whole offshoot with the B vitamins. Yeah. What I do know is that we don't have all the B vitamins because. Originally, there was some that we thought was a B vitamin. Then we discovered, okay, actually not truly a vitamin in the pure sense of the word. And so those got thrown out. That's why there's no B4.
Why don't we just throw vitamin C into B4? Why don't we make...
I'm with you, man.
It's just weird.
I'll make some signs. I'm down with this.
Yeah.
Although it's really going to change a lot of marketing out there. Right? I mean, think about all the labels that would have to change if all of a sudden it's vitamin B4 rather than C. And I think vitamin C, from a PR perspective, would have a little bit of a beef because now it'd be into this category, and it's not even the first of the category. Right. It's the fourth. Now here I go, personalizing vitamins, but that's what I do.
But that being said, when we talk about a vitamin, it's really just this organic compound that has biological activity in our body, made up of little molecules called vitamers. Therefore, it's called a vitamin. And
one of the things that's a sort of distinguishing factor is the body can't make it intrinsically, or if it can, it makes it at very small levels. So the body that has to be acquired in some way, shape, or form, like in the sense of vitamin D, requires activation from sunlight to make it so, or getting it through your diet. So that's the very nature of a vitamin is you can become deficient because your body is insufficient at making it on its own.
Right. And so we're talking about B12 specifically, and these are called the cobalamins because they have the mineral cobalt as part of their structure.
Oh, I didn't know that. That's interesting.
Yeah. Why the gong?
Oh, that's our enlightenment sound. Anytime something is enlightening and we've learned something, then that's the gong.
Big fan of cobalt, huh? So why do we care about vitamin B12? Why do we need it? What does it do?
Vitamin B12 has a lot of actions in the body. If you're asking me this question, naturally I'm going to go into the biochemistry.
Here we go.
So one of the biggest things I think of with respect to B12 is its involvement in the methylation cycle, right? It's involved in remethylating homocysteine back to methionine. So you're not having elevations of homocysteine. That's a huge thing that B12 does in the body. It has other aspects. There's other pathways that involve B12 as well, but that's a biggie.
Yeah, it's helpful in DNA synthesis, which is kind of important, red blood cells, neurologic function. So it's one of those things that's involved in so many different processes in your body.
And you just listed off a couple different like sort of physiological processes. I'm wondering how much of those physiological processes at their core are because of its relationship to the methylation cycle, right? You're talking about DNA synthesis, and there we're talking about folate and folate metabolism, and that's heavily responsible for DNA synthesis. You're talking about, what was the other one that you mentioned? Neurological function, like that's very much related to methylation. So, I think you can sort of draw a line between those two, the physiologic and the biochemical processes.
Okay, so we know that we need it from our diet, right? Or from vitamins, taking supplements. What are the foods that contain B12? What are the things you think about?
Meat.
Meat.
Yeah.
Just meat.
I think about meat.
Yeah,
I think about a lot of animal products, and like liver. Liver's going to be real high in vitamin B12, but even skeletal tissues, our meats, are going to be higher in B12 as compared to our vegetable foods.
Yeah, and there are certain bacteria in our microbiome that actually make vitamin B12.
Get out of here. Our microbiome doesn't do that. That's ridiculous.
It does
ridiculous
too.
assertion.
So we get it from foods, like Michael just said, meat. Also, some of the bacteria in your gut, which is super important, or people supplement with vitamin B12.
Can I make an aside here?
Go ahead.
Because I'm thinking about meat and animal products, and I would include eggs in that.
That's true.
And I want people to understand that eggs is not dairy. Eggs is a meat product.
That's right.
I think we get confused because of its location in the grocery store, like in the dairy aisle.
Right.
And people are like, oh, I got to cut out eggs too. If you're eliminating dairy, eggs are not dairy.
Well, then what does that make eggnog?
Well, it's a combination of both, right?
Wow.
Because it's eggs and dairy.
Hence the confusion. Either way, vitamin B12 all around. But if we're getting it from our diet, right, and we know that sometimes people don't get enough from their diet.
Sure. So that's a big if.
Right. So what are some of the signs and symptoms that we might look for in someone who might be insufficient in vitamin B12 status?
Yeah, and you could maybe make the distinction between what they might present as is whether they're insufficient is deficient. They might have more overt signs if they're truly deficient than insufficient. Maybe that's splitting hairs there, but things I think about are like classically macrocytic anemia, right? That's going to be like the big one that you're looking out for, but also things like neurological issues, neurological disorders, psychiatric symptoms, including things like memory loss, depression, confusion, paranoia have been associated with problems around B12, glossitis.
Oh, that's the big one. Everyone thinks about glossitis.
Hyperpigmentation of the skin, do you know that?
I did not.
Orthostatic hypotension. And maybe even some impaired immune function, like how well leukocytes can kill bacteria. That's involved in B12 as well. So, a lot of things you can be looking out for. There's a ton more that are related or might be improved by appropriate B12 or adequate B12 stores, but that's just a few of the things you might see in office.
And I sort of think about neuropathy and big tongue,
sure,
anemia. I mean, those are the ones that are most common, but all of those are intriguing.
Fatigue.
Subtle things you wouldn't think about.
Fatigue for sure, you got to put in there.
Oh, yeah. But then the question then becomes, how? How are people deficient or insufficient? And so you think about, okay, so when you eat foods that have vitamin B12 in them, right?
Sure.
So you have hydrochloric acid that breaks down the food, and then there's something in the stomach lining.
From the parietal cells.
Correct. And then there's something that's released called intrinsic factor. And intrinsic factor is what's needed to absorb the B12. So there are patients who are deficient in intrinsic factor, and that's called pernicious anemia.
Yeah, and specifically, pernicious anemia is actually an autoimmune condition where the immune system is attacking, destroying the cells that are making the intrinsic factor.
Right. And so then you think about as patients get older, they make less and less hydrochloric acid, or if they're on proton pump inhibitor. I mean, these are other things to consider in someone who's insufficient in their vitamin B12 status?
Yeah, so there's a couple things at play, right? There's the hypochlorhydria that might result in problems around releasing the B12 that is bound to proteins and intracellularly. And then there's also the ability to absorb. So you're talking about how well someone's digesting with hypochlorhydria, and then you're talking about how well someone is absorbing with problems around intrinsic factor.
Right. So you think you could have problems with both of those factors, like you just outlined. Then the other concept is, what about patients who are vegetarian or vegan, who aren't getting a lot of meat products?
They're at a high risk for developing some B12 insufficiency and down the road B12 deficiency. And there's a whole spectrum of how long it takes to exhaust B12 stores.
Yeah, how long?
Well, the general consensus is that it can take, if you're going from a regular, normal, adequate B12 intake, it can take 3 to 5 years to exhaust your stores. Although that's not to necessarily say that functionally you might have some insufficiencies at a cellular level. So I would make that distinction quite clearly.
Yeah, and we make that distinction a lot in functional medicine. Like you can do conventional blood tests for some of these vitamins, and they're quote unquote within the normal range, but we both know that normal range from conventional medicine is different than optimal here in functional medicine. So it is a big distinction.
Yeah, and you just made the case that we've got these different methods for testing vitamin B12, and it could very well be the case that somebody can have a normal serum B12 or maybe even a high serum B12 level, and that they may not be functionally adequate from a B12 perspective. And so, like, that's pretty crazy.
It's important to know. And
I'll make one note too, that actually I saw a lecture with Dr. Ben Lynch, and he mentioned that because bacteria produce vitamin B12 in the gut, and we're not distinguishing what type of B12 that we are testing for when we're doing a serum B12, it's possible that seeing normal or high levels of B12 on a blood test might be indicative of something going on the dysbiosis front, specifically like a SIBO or a bacterial overgrowth.
That's fascinating.
It's pretty interesting.
And then it makes you really question, the conventional testing of B12, which, okay, we know it has its limitations. There's also some good things about it. But here at Genova...
It certainly can identify a B12 deficiency.
Of course. But here at Genova, we measure it in a different way. We do functional measurements,
yeah,
which we've talked about.
Yeah.
We're measuring steps in biochemical pathways that we know require vitamin B12 to make that step process through.
Yeah.
So we can gather a bunch of information from various pathways to give us some insight into how well B12 is functioning on a biochemical cellular level.
Right.
So when I say vitamin B12, what do you think about?
I think about a specific biomarker.
Which one?
It's called methylmalonic acid.
I think it's time for the jingle.
You better know a biomarker. You think you know? You think you know your biomarkers? You don't know. You don't know your biomarkers. This is Better Know Biomarker.
Seriously.
We sank a lot of money into that one.
Seriously.
We really went all out for that one.
The greatest jingle that you've ever made.
I think we still need to pay that band.
I love that so much. Well, Michael, why don't you help us better know the biomarker methylmalonic acid, or MMA, as we call it?
So methylmalonic acid is technically an organic acid, and it is part of a pathway that converts some of our amino acids ultimately into the direction that they're going towards is succinic acid to be used in the citric acid cycle for energy production. So it can sort of fill in some of the gaps in the citric acid cycle. You can break down your amino acids from protein and feed them into the Krebs cycle for energy production.
Yeah.
So that's handy.
Yeah.
But one of the problems that can arise is one of the last steps in this pathway is heavily B12 dependent.
So you have all of these amino acids and some fatty acids becoming methylmalonyl-CoA, which then needs to be broken down into succinyl-CoA to enter the Krebs cycle.
Yes, and that is the step that is B12 dependent.
Right.
And so what happens if you have B12 insufficiency cellularly, then you can have essentially it gets stuck right there, that methylmalonyl-CoA, and instead that breaks down into a metabolite called methylmalonic acid, and it's sort of like the end stage of that step. So it's sort of like a runoff valve, right? Yeah. And so if you start to see higher levels of methylmalonic acid in the urine, it's an indication that there's a need in the cell for vitamin B12 because this pathway is all jammed up, as one might say.
All jammed up?
I was the one who might say that.
Can you dumb that down for us, Michael?
The one person who might say something like that.
It's all jammed up, gummed up the works. But they've also shown that vitamin B12 therapy can lower your MMA levels, which is interesting.
Yeah, and it's actually pretty well conventionally understood that methylmalonic acid is a really great marker for vitamin B12. And actually, the Mayo Clinic even came out at one point and said that this may be a better indicator of vitamin B12 status than serum B12 alone.
Great. So order Genova's urinary organic acids, either on the NutriVal, Metabolomics Plus, the metabolic analysis profile, and you'll get to see that biomarker.
Yeah, and the thing to know about that, too, is if we're recommending or if we're assessing for B12 on some of our nutritional tests, we're not just looking at methylmalonic acid either. We're looking at tons of other pathways that equally are related to vitamin B12 as well. So you're getting this biochemical footprint understanding of cellular processes that require B12, and we're looking for all the backups in those pathways.
You mean like if they're jammed up?
That's right.
Wow. Okay, so if your methylmalonic acid is high, for example,
right,
and maybe your dietary intake isn't great and you need some B12, the question I have is how much? Like, how much do we need every day?
Well, I think you're going to find some debate out there. One place you can always start is sort of the dietary guidelines, but whether that's actually optimal for some people is a little bit questionable. But like the dietary guidelines state that people need adults should get about 2.4 micrograms per day of vitamin B12.
That doesn't seem like a lot.
It doesn't seem like a lot, maybe because it's micrograms. You're like, wow, micrograms.
Just a little and only 2.4.
Can't even see it. What a beyond Avogadro's number there. What's the deal?
It doesn't seem like a lot.
Yeah, but when you think about it, if you're looking at the content of vitamin B12 in certain foods, it's actually not as impressive, unless you're eating something like liver, which is super high in vitamin B12. If you're just eating kind of regular standard American diet, or especially if you're eating vegetarian vegan, you might have some problems. So for example, just pulling from this list that I've got in front of me, salmon, that's got 4.8. So if you have salmon, fairly frequently, but that you're not going to have salmon every day, right? So like if you have just like beef, that's going to be 1.4 micrograms, and then you've still got to fill in a little bit of extra B12 throughout the day, and that's just, on a daily basis.
So yeah, I guess it is easier to become insufficient in B12. I didn't think about it, because you're right, because of micrograms, you think, oh, that's not a lot, but when you can consider how much is in each food, it can really add up to be a deficiency. So what else? What are some other good sources of vitamin B12?
Well, on this list, it says a cheeseburger.
What
is you got 2.1 micrograms there?
Wait.
I like that they distinguished a hamburger from a cheeseburger. I think that's really important. They know what we're eating at least, right? The cheeseburger, and it says one sandwich too. Like, is a cheeseburger a sandwich?
Of course.
Is it?
Yeah.
I mean, it fits the definition.
That's right.
It's maybe like a subset of the sandwich family, perhaps.
It's just interesting that they made that distinction.
Yeah.
Probably because of the cheese. But now you could see
I'm sure American cheese, highly processed American cheese, is a great source of vitamin B12.
You never know.
Okay.
Well, let's just say your diet is not really high in vitamin B12. Some people take supplements, right? And most supplements of vitamin B12, they're usually present as cyanocobalamin, which is a form that your body has to convert to the active form of methylcobalamin and then adenosylcobalamin.
Right. And that begs the question, too, well, I've heard that there's supplements of methylcobalamin. Why don't I just take that? And if you flip back to a recent conversation we had with Mr. Dr. Tom Williams, he actually makes the case that it's not really all that beneficial to be taking a methylcobalamin, because what happens is once it hits your GI tract, the methyl group gets stripped off, or the body, actually, I don't even know if it's in the GI tract, but it's in the process of digestion and metabolism, the body strips away that methyl group and then has to reapply it. The body has to essentially do de novo synthesis of methylcobalamin. So you might be spending extra money on this, and unless you're doing maybe injections of methylcobalamin, that might be a little bit more beneficial. You might be bypassing some of that. But it was an interesting conversation.
Well, then this begs the question, Michael.
Yeah.
So if we're saying
Is it the question?
No.
Oh. Okay.
Just a question.
Oh, okay.
Not the question of the day. But if your daily recommended allowance, like the basic, is just like 2.5 micrograms,
sure,
right? Clearly probably need a little bit more based on utilization and, energy expenditure. But why are the supplements like 500 micrograms or hundreds of micrograms if all we need is really kind of just 2.5 or just a couple?
It's interesting because some studies have shown that when it comes to intrinsic factor and our ability to really absorb how bioavailable this B12 is, intrinsic factor becomes saturated at B12 doses greater than about 2 micrograms.
What?
So like that, then you would think that you're just wasting a bunch of the
well, then what happens?
4,998 micrograms that you're taking.
What happens?
Well, so there is a process that's independent of intrinsic factor where larger doses can be absorbed by passive diffusion. So that's possible as well.
Okay.
And so that could be one of the reasons why we might see some benefit from these larger doses of vitamin B12.
Okay, that makes a little bit more sense then.
Here's one other additional bit of information that I think is helpful to understand, at least from a biochemical physiologic process standpoint as it relates to B12. So there is a protein called transcobalamin.
Oh, yeah.
Not to be confused with the forms of cobalamin that you can supplement. But this is a protein that's required for the transportation of B12 as well as cellular uptake and utilization of B12. And so transcobalamin is really, really important. And there is actually a SNP for transcobalamin that can be hugely detrimental to how we utilize B12, and it's estimated that approximately 20% of the population is homozygous positive for this transcobalamin SNP. So they may have just essentially regular B12 status based on serum B12 levels, but because they're inefficient at cellular uptake and transport of B12, they may have higher needs for B12. So, and that's 20% of the population. So that's something to keep in mind too.
Yeah.
Well, Patty, I think this has been helpful.
It has. I've learned a lot, actually.
Yeah, this has been good. I just have one last thing. I've got this little, somebody wrote this in. I think this is, I think it's time for question of the day.
Oh, gosh. What time is it?
What time is it?
You know what time it is.
You know.
Question of the day. Question of the day. Question of the day. Question of the day.
Wait, what time is it?
No, seriously, what time is it?
I think you know what time it is. Question of the day. Question of the day. Question of the day. Question of the day.
Okay, that's the least offensive. I'll allow it. I will allow it.
All right. So here's the question of the day.
Okay.
I got this patient. I've had this happen a lot.
Is this a question from you or from a listener?
I'm not going to disclose that information.
Okay, go
I'm
ahead.
going to protect the privacy of the
Apologies.
listener or myself. So we come back with some blood labs, do serum B12. Maybe I ordered this. Maybe somebody else ordered it. And it's high.
Okay.
And the patient's been taking B12. And they're like, oh my gosh, I got high levels of B12. Like, what do I do? Like, I'm concerned. I tried to look this up on Dr. Google, and like, there's some really bad things, but I don't know. I don't know what this means. What does it mean?
Well, it's a great question. And interestingly about vitamin B12, some of the regulatory bodies like the IOM, Institute of Medicine, they don't establish an upper limit for vitamin B12 because it's got a very low potential for toxicity, which is interesting. They state that there's really no adverse effects associated with excessive vitamin B12 intake from food or supplements. And there are actually some intervention trials that support that. Something called the Norvit trial or the HOPE-2 trial. These are trials where they gave upwards of 0.4 milligrams or 1 milligram for months and years with no bad side effects.
Yeah.
And if you can consider that we're talking about micrograms for the daily recommended intake, to give a milligram per day is significant. And they didn't really find any very significant clinical side effects from excessive vitamin B12.
Oh.
It doesn't mean you should go, taking buckets of it every day, but it's fairly safe.
Yeah, generally well tolerated.
Oh, well, I couldn't agree more.
Well, that was fun. I think we learned a lot today about vitamin B12. But what I just looked up is, do you know how much vitamin B12 is in eggnog?
No, I don't know. This will be curious to find.
1.1 micrograms.
Delicious. Next time on the Lab Report, Dr. Sandra Scheinbaum.
Yeah, we're going to talk about functional medicine health coaching.
And we're going to ask her a little something about positive psychology.
You've been listening to the Lab Report. If you like what you hear, please subscribe to our podcast, rate us, and leave us a review. To learn more about Genova Diagnostics, visit our website at gdx.net. There you'll find information on specific testing, educational resources, and how to connect with our show. Call us at 1-800-522-4762 or email us at podcast@gdx.net.
All right, societal question here.
Oh, no. What?
When is the appropriate time to put up the Christmas tree?
Ooh, well, it depends who you ask.
Well, I'm asking you.
I would say Thanksgiving, after Thanksgiving.
The day after Thanksgiving?
Or Thanksgiving Day.
Thanksgiving Day?
The whole family's
You're not
there.
busy
Why not?
enough on Thanksgiving
Listen,
Day?
The whole family's there.
Making the
Why
turkey?
not have everyone pitch in?
How about you wait until the one holiday's over before you start the next holiday?
Well, there are people who put their tree up around like Halloween.
Oh, I know.
Do you like that? When do you put your tree up?
The day after Thanksgiving.
Oh, great. Here come the angry emails.
Send them to patty@gdx.net.